people will come first once again. These are the forgotten men and women of our country, and they are forgotten, but they're not going to be forgotten long. These are people who work hard, but no longer have a voice. I am your voice.
In this programme, we'll be looking at how the surprising rise of Donald Trump has been accompanied by a new and unexpected political movement which has caused a flurry on social media and is known to itself as the alt-right. Now step inside the briefing room and find out about the alt-right. Joining me will be Milo Yiannopoulos, a figurehead of the movement, and Cathy Young, one of its sharpest critics. But first, our reporter Mike Wendling has set out to define what the alt-right is.
There was a moment this summer when the phrase alt-right first started to get real attention from the mainstream media, and it all started with a tweet.
Next to her face was what appeared to be a Star of David. Emblazoned over the Star of David were the words, "most corrupt candidate ever." And underneath Hillary Clinton was a giant pile of money.
A picture including what some said was a Jewish symbol, great big piles of money, and Donald Trump's opponent. So were his critics being overly sensitive, or was Trump somehow suggesting some stereotypical conspiracy? Well, it's not really clear because his campaign has refused to fully explain the story behind the image. One thing we do know is that the picture originated on 8chan. That's a website known for extreme images and absolute anything goes free speech. Anthony Smith is a journalist for the website Mike. He's the one who tracked the original image down.
I saw it and I thought, oh my God, what could his campaign possibly be thinking by putting this out there? It's part and parcel of this same amorphous, fragmented movement that's called the alt-right.
Many people who encountered this movement online will be familiar with this sort of story. People who call themselves alt-right share grossly offensive pictures on Twitter and on Facebook and other websites. Believe me when I say that a Star of David on a pile of money is at the more tame end of the spectrum. But if offensiveness and trolling were all there was to it, we wouldn't be discussing it now. There's also a serious strain of thought here. It's nativist, tribalist, anti-establishment, extremely conservative. Anthony Smith describes the movement's origins in the wake of the election of Barack Obama.
In November of 2008, a man named Paul Gottfried, who is president of a society called the H.L. Mencken Society, called for the creation of an alternative right, an independent right that functions not tied to the establishment, so they weren't beholden to necessarily anyone. And because they weren't beholden to anyone, they would be fearsome for anyone that opposed them. At its core, it identified black radicalism, radical feminists, open borders advocates. These are the enemies. So the enemy is progressive society. The enemy is political correctness. From there, in the wake of America electing its first black president, all of a sudden you started to see these people rise from the shadows and really start organizing in a way that they'd never organized before.
For years, the alt-right was just a fringe, mostly online subculture, but interest in it has shot up along with Trump's presidential prospects. It's intrigued all manner of conservatives who are angry at the establishment and some people who weren't very conservative to begin with. And it's no longer just an American phenomenon. It's now, if this makes sense, an international nationalist movement. Iain Davis is a supporter. He lives in Surrey and he runs an alt-right Twitter feed. Unlike many self-described members of the movement, he's happy to give his name. I asked him to give me a rundown of the components of the alt-right. It was eye-opening from the very start.
I brought my little colourful diagram. It looks like a plate of multicoloured spaghetti, which roughly explains what the alt-right is. And sort of to the left, you have the National Socialists.
So there's there's a political movement that has a National Socialist, a Nazi end of it.
Yeah. And around that, there's a whole plethora of other different groups, like the neo-pagans and the pagan traditionalists, Christian traditionalists, conservative nationalists. all sorts of different flavours of libertarians, the men's rights movement, but also there's a sort of traditional female movement growing up where women want to live traditional lives, where men are doing the working and they're looking after families and raising, that kind of thing. Also, there's the burgeoning human biodiversity movement, and these people are very interested in the differences between races, different variances in intelligence levels and capabilities, and how they differ without making it too racist. I mean, they're quite interested in ideas that homogenous societies work better. So there's all these ideas happening in there.
A lot of ideas, yes, and a lot of them are hugely controversial, if not just plain pseudoscience. This is a movement with few leaders and, as of yet, a lack of a coherent ideology or strategy. But they do agree on some things, perhaps chief among them, opposition to political correctness and to immigration, particularly immigration to the West from the Middle East. And here's the interesting bit. Those concerns resonate with ordinary voters in America. Listen to these Donald Trump supporters who've been stopped on the street by the BBC in California and elsewhere. They're not, as far as we know, alt-right, just ordinary conservatives.
I think that a guy like him, who's not political, is not polished, not saying what everybody wants to hear, is exactly the kind of guy who can get something done and would really do it.
He's worried about terrorism from Islamic extremists, and I'm in fear for my life.
Saying what everybody's politically afraid to say about immigration.
You know, I know he's causing a little stink with all the stuff he says, but I think he's awesome.
Oliver Lee Bateman is a freelance journalist, and in the course of writing for Vice magazine, he got to know 24 or so alt-right activists in the US. Now, this is more difficult than it sounds because generally they don't use their own names online and would prefer to cook up clever tweets than talk to journalists. From his admittedly limited sample, Oliver Lee Bateman gave me his impression of the kinds of people who are drawn to the alt-right.
If they're college students, and I've talked to them, they're college students who might be bright, but they don't feel like they fit in, or they feel like they're being put upon. If they're in their 30s, they feel like, quote unquote, they're losing their country. The country's identity is changing. They're often people who work completely boring, bureaucratic, or programming jobs. They don't want to put their names and faces out there. That's a common characteristic.
Although Oliver Lee Bateman sees some demographic consistency, he also sees a movement divided between intellectual leaders, of which there are relatively few, and garden variety trolls. If one thing brings them together, it's Donald Trump.
I quickly realized that the folks that I was talking to were among the most articulate and educated within that group. But then there's this level below them, and they're running these very gross sort of hate group pages that's filled with a lot of old school racists, conspiracy theorists, people that just want to post caricatures of Jewish people that are very disgusting. A lot of the users hide behind cartoon images or fake names because they know some of these ideas are repugnant. And when Trump came along and began saying things like, I'm going to build a wall, or began saying things like, Saddam Hussein wasn't a bad guy. He killed terrorists. He kept people from leaving the country. They liked that. They felt that he was opening this so-called window to all kinds of discourse that we weren't able to say. A lot of them didn't trust that he would be the perfect candidate for them, but they were really, really happy that he was able to get away with saying so many things that hadn't been said for so long in the United States.
Until Trump came along, only fringe Republicans in American politics called for mass deportation of immigrants, for banning Muslims, or for border walls. Those positions are rare red meat to the alt-right, although some strands of the alt-right go even further. Many of them want an ethnically pure, all-white homeland on the North American continent. They seem to be united by division.
I'm not sure a lot of us see some great big super huge ethno-state that spans from Europe to Australia, but we would like people in their own countries.
Iain Davis, the British alt-right activist, says that in this country the alt-right movement is growing, although
it's nowhere near as big as the American scene. And I'm not surprised. We're the nation that fought fascism. We're renowned and we pride ourselves on the fact that we went and bashed Hitler. And it's always going to be associated with this National Socialist element when, in truth, we're probably nearer to the kind of conservatism you saw 30, 40 years ago.
Anthony Smith, the journalist from Mike who dug up the Star of David story, says the alt-right is quite difficult to quantify. They use these extreme free speech websites like 8chan, the one I mentioned before, but even on Twitter and Facebook, most don't reveal their real names. But he has no doubt that the alt-right is starting to make an impact on mainstream politics.
We don't have an idea of like how many of these people are out there, but they congregate around